Okay, hello everyone. I think we're about ready to begin. Thank you guys for coming out in a rainy Wednesday morning. My name is Matthew Watkins. I'm a reporter for the Texas Tribune here in Austin. For people from outside the state, we're a nonprofit public policy and politics website. Been around for about 6 years now. I cover higher education for the site, and I'm the moderator for today's panel on sexual assault on campus. I'll go down the line here and introduce our other panelists. To my immediate left, we have John Zerwas, who is a longtime physician and member of the House of Representatives since 2007, is that right? And he represents the town of Richmond and other areas in Fort Bend County, and is chairman of the House Higher Education Committee in the legislature. Next to him is Annie Clark, who is co-founder of End Rape on Campus, a nonprofit organization, and she was lead complainant in the Title IX Clery Act complaint against her alma mater, UNC Chapel Hill. She's a contributing writer for the Huffington Post, MSNBC, and Chronicle Vitae, and she worked with Senator Gillibrand on the Bipartisan Accountability and Safety Act in 2003, right? 13, oh yeah, excuse me, 2013. If you guys saw the showing of the documentary, The Hunting Ground, last night, she was featured in that documentary, and coming out in April is a book she co-wrote called We Believe You. And then down at the end of the row here is Representative Donna Howard. She is a Democratic state representative from Austin. During her career in public service, she's put a strong focus on education. She served in the Eanes ISD School Board in the late 1990s. And now she is vice chair of the House Higher Education Committee. So welcome to all you, and thanks for being here. So everyone up here was at the Capitol yesterday for a hearing by the House Higher Education Committee on the subject of sexual assault on campus. This subject has also been included in what are called the interim charges. The Texas legislature meets every 2 years, and in the time between those sessions, the House Speaker lays out some suggestions about what he wants the lawmakers to study. Sexual assault on campus is one of those things, and the hearing yesterday kind of began to delve into the issues that you guys will be exploring over the next year and a half. Chairman Zerwas, tell me a little bit about what you guys are hoping to accomplish and what you guys want to learn about this subject.
Well, thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to serve on this panel. This is my first time on with Ms. Clark, but Representative Howard and I have served on many panels together, and it's always a great opportunity to be on here with her and for us to lay out our thoughts on a lot of subjects, particularly this one, since we together, lead the House Committee on Higher Education. The Speaker, as you mentioned, lays out several interim charges for all the committees that we have. 7 interim charges were laid out for higher ed. I sort of discount one of those because it's just kind of an all-encompassing thing, everything under this agency, blah, 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 and then, the other charges has to do with online type access to higher education, funding issues, accessibility. This is a singular issue on policy that I think stands out, and I think it's a reflection of the Speaker's concern about it. For us as a legislative body to say, what are we doing? I would say I certainly don't think we're doing enough based on the numbers that we've seen out there and so forth. And the purpose of this interim period of time and having hearings like we did yesterday is to really do a deeper dive into that. First, like most things, that understand what we're dealing with, listen to the people who are bringing forth testimony, and then from there try to say, okay, this is where we are today in the state of Texas. Are there other legislative remedies that we can perhaps move forward that could make a difference? Now, last legislative session, we had one bill that went forward that basically in a nutshell said, look, universities, you need to have a single page dedicated to sexual assault, the resources available, and frankly, it should be readily accessible when you go online. Representative Howard will speak to that a little bit, as she did yesterday in the hearing. I would say clearly that is not enough. All of us sitting in that hearing and on the dais I think, heard a lot of testimony to say this is a journey that we haven't found into, but we need to get there sooner versus later because I think the enormous impact that it has on these young adults' lives at a very formidable part of their life. It's an incredibly complicated issue because of the nature of college campuses, and it requires a very thoughtful process like the one that we have here in the interim to kind of bring forward perhaps a legislative agenda portfolio, if you will, of things that we think might be useful from a state's perspective to help us get to obviously a much better place than where we are right now.
Representative Howard, what have you guys been learning so far about this subject?
Well, as Chairman Zerwas just pointed out, I think what's been most alarming to us to learn about is how prevalent this issue is. And, you know, I think we all have a certain responsibility here when we look at how these numbers have really been before us for quite some time. And for whatever reason, they haven't been up front and center. I think that's one of the things we'll hear from Annie, that she and the people she's been working with have done a tremendous job at making sure that we're aware of what's going on and forcing us to address this. Some of the legislation that we've had that Chairman Zerwas referred to as well, I think came out of the frustration of those of us that set policy at the legislative level to actually try to do something to intervene here. Certainly this is something that we would expect the institutions to jump on and take care of themselves. And I'm happy to see a lot of things going on. But certainly a lot more could go on, and I think that it does bring us to the question of where have the institutions been? Why has this not been addressed? So we still have a lot to look at here. The University of Texas system in particular has been involved, as I think you're probably going to bring up some about the studies that they're undertaking right now to look at prevalence and rates and to look at perceptions on campuses, how reporting is addressed, if reporting is occurring, what we need to be doing. And so I think we're really in a fact-gathering mode right now to find out what is happening in our state, what are the best practices, what do we need to be doing to ensure that we are doing everything we can to make our campuses safe for the students who attend those campuses, that we are doing everything we can to prevent, change the culture, and certainly make the process one that is fair, that is sensitive to the unique dynamics of this issue. So a whole lot of things we need to be looking at as we look toward the next session during this interim and determine if there is any kind of legislative intervention that we need to make sure we put into place.
Sure. Let's take a step back and look at kind of what the situation is on the ground right now. You know, we've seen studies, lots of different studies that have suggested that between 1/4 and 1/5 of female students at universities encounter some kind of sexual assault or sexual violence while they're in college. A recent study by the members of the American Association of Universities looked at each individual schools. At UT Austin here, that number was, I believe, 18%. At Texas A&M, that number was 15%. Annie Clark, yesterday you mentioned, I believe, that at A&M, all universities are required to report to the federal government when a sexual assault occurs, right? At A&M, the annual reports often have fewer than 10 reported as happening on their campuses. What's happening here? What's the discrepancy?
So first of all, thank you so much for having me, and it's an honor to be on this panel with two state representatives, and it's just great to be here in Texas. So the law you're referring to is called the Clery Act, which is a federal law that requires universities to report crimes to the Department of Education annually. And those crimes aren't just sexual assault, it's burglary, arson, murder. And this law came about because a student at Lehigh University named Jean Clery was raped and murdered, and no one at the university at Lehigh told the campus community. And so you think about this in a safety context. If something happens on your campus, you ought to be aware of it. And so with these annual reporting statistics, we find most campuses do have very low numbers. And there's an incentive to keep numbers low in terms of crime. If you are, a student or a parent who's looking at a college and you see one school who has 3 reports of sexual assault and one who has 60, your instinct is to think that the 3 number is a safer campus, when in actuality that might be completely the opposite. So low numbers, I would encourage you to think about as maybe a red flag and not representative of what's actually happening on campus. So if a school has low numbers like that, it either means students don't know how to report, don't feel safe coming forward. The university might be unintentionally under-reporting and not know that they have that obligation to report, or they might be intentionally covering something up. And another nuance to the Clery Act is that it is geographical. So it is a geography-based law. So if you have a sexual assault occur on campus, that has to be reported. But if it's off campus and a university, a housing facility that the university does not own, even though all students live there, crimes don't have to be reported. And so you're comparing apples to oranges a lot of times if you don't have a residential campus. So even if there are a lot of sexual assaults, they don't actually have to be reported if they're not happening on university property.
As I mentioned up front, you were involved in bringing complaints against UNC for maybe not living up to some of these expectations. What was happening? What were the problems you were seeing when you were on campus?
So in 2013, myself along with 4 others filed a Title IX complaint and a Clery Act complaint against UNC Chapel Hill. And Title IX, a lot of people associate that with sports and thinking about equality in terms of what's funded in men's and women's sports teams. But actually all Title IX says is that you should have an equal education and equal access to education regardless of your sex. And so there was a case, 1979, 1980, actually, at Yale, where 5 women argued that they did not have an equal access to education based on the prevalence of sexual harassment that they were experiencing. And so we basically said, if sexual harassment is a barrier to education, of course sexual assault and rape are as well. And it's not just the one-time instance, it's if that perpetrator or that friend is harassing you and they live in your dorm room, if they're in your classes, if you see them at the dining hall. And so in 2011, the Department of Education issued something called a Dear Colleague letter, which was basically a reminder to schools that they had this obligation to do something about sexual assault on campus. And some universities saw that, some really didn't pay attention. And then in 2013, we basically, as young 20-somethings, said there's this law here that nobody is really following, and UNC is not unique in that. They had a responsibility to respond to sexual assault, to prevent it from happening, and if they knew or reasonably should know of a problem area on campus, they should do something to address it. And they weren't, but they very much were not alone in that. So like some of the schools in Texas, UNC is a microcosm of what's happening nationally across the country, and schools were grappling with that issue. And so filing the complaints, as you mentioned, was not something we wanted to do. It's really out of love. If you love something, you hold it accountable. And we had been trying for years to get UNC to change and follow their own policies and make sure they were doing something well to address the issue. And so we filed these complaints as sort of a last resort, as a statement to say, you have to do something about this. And we did it in a very public way, which was a little bit unprecedented. And I had, honestly, the privilege to be here because I'm not living in fear of a perpetrator right now. The media did listen to me. I can tell my story and be heard, and a lot of people don't have that platform. So I want to take a step back and do acknowledge that I do have that privilege, and it's impacting a lot of people who either don't want to come forward or can't come forward. And so the 5 of us decided that we did have that platform to sort of make a national statement and say, this is not about our stories, this is not about UNC, this is a national thing that needs to be addressed. And when we gave people that space space to talk, they did. And so we heard from students all around the country experiencing very similar issues, many of whom were in Texas, and that eventually led to the creation of our organization, End Rape on Campus, which is to address a lot of these issues, both in direct service and in policy work.
So speaking about Title IX and some of the responsibilities that these schools have, particularly when the school is notified or a sexual assault is reported on campus. Correct me if I'm wrong here, but the expectation here is that the school itself should investigate, and that investigation should happen even if police or some kind of law enforcement is also taking a look at the case. If the allegation is deemed credible, oftentimes a disciplinary hearing will occur, and one of the things that I believe has been made clear by the federal government is that the standard to act is lower than in a criminal court, right? So instead of you need to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that a university or that a sexual assault occurred in order to take some kind of punitive action or other kind of action. The standard is more likely than not, preponderance of the evidence. And then beyond that, there's also expectations for how you react and how you help the person who has made this report over the time. If a student is having trouble feeling uncomfortable in classes, or there are certain resources that you're expected to provide. My question, I guess for Representative Zerwas is, have you been able to get much of a gauge as to how seriously universities in Texas are taking these responsibilities, and what issues have come up as they try to handle them?
Yeah, I think that's part of our charge, is to get an understanding better on a statewide basis where the different universities are with regard to their ability to respond to this and how they handled it. I think some have come forward with some very robust efforts to try to prevent this kind of thing. I applaud those efforts and stuff. Some have come forward with the ideas, okay, once the event occurs, how does law enforcement engage the individual? Because what we know is that every time you engage a person on this issue, it can be a traumatic experience. And there's no doubt that post-traumatic stress syndrome disease in this particular area, as Annie has pointed out, is more frequent than what we see in our war theaters and stuff. So it has to be handled very carefully on the side when it's actually already occurred. And I think we're seeing some things come out. University of Texas recently came out with a blueprint on this, and I think that's a very thoughtful and a very good document steeped in evidence that is going to be valuable to universities. And so I think that's going to be something that's going to come out. Obviously, what we want to do is for them to never have to, utilize that type of engagement at all, and would there be some things that they could do to prevent it? And, such as Texas A&M yesterday in our hearing, and I think I commented to this, they had a very robust effort towards trying to help their student body understand the importance of this issue. What are the resources? How are you to, kind of be on guard about this kind of thing, because whether we like it or not, it's, as Representative Howard said, it's social and culturally part of what's going on in the campuses. And those are very difficult issues no matter what kind of organization you're dealing with. When you have these social, cultural, difficult issues to deal with, there are likewise difficult things, solutions for them. And so it's not any one remedy that fixes all, otherwise it obviously wouldn't come to us for consideration as to whether we're accomplishing those things. So I think that people are on a different journey, in terms of where they are on this. I do think that highlighting it, the way the Speaker has brought this forth as an interim charge, certainly the press, gets hold of these things, and they do get a pretty good visibility out there to the public because of the press. To some extent, that's what this requires. It requires, a spotlight being put on it, and that is a very, very strong incentive for us to be sure that we're doing legitimate things that can make a difference. My thought as I listened to everything that Texas A&M was laying out there and others was, I said, well, that's great. It's fun to get caught doing things, but let's get caught making a difference in outcomes. And so I think the key will be to watch and see, okay, is there a difference in the outcomes? We need to be sure that the reporting is occurring and it's occurring in a legitimate way. And, I think that, we've seen some of that come up. We hope to see some of that plateau, and hopefully we'll see that go down. I mean, we hope that law enforcement never has to get engaged in these things. That's going to be a journey in and of itself. So in the interim, we have to have very well-trained, compassionate law enforcement who understand how to engage this type of act. But we need to be sure that we're trying a lot of things so that we can rid this from the fabric of what exists in some of our universities.
Representative Howard, Title IX is a federal statute. Texas doesn't have enforcement powers over that. The state of Texas, lawmakers in particular. So what is left for the states to do? How can you guys make sure that your universities are treating this situation in the right way?
Well, I think that's part of what we're doing right now, by having the hearing, by making sure we're talking about this, by finding out what is going on and making sure that there's attention being paid. The legislation that came out of last session that is requiring placement on websites, orientation, training, and information sharing. Our role there is to make sure those things are happening now, though, and in a way that's actually being effective. The Title IX thing, I think what was most interesting that came out of yesterday's hearing was the clear differentiation between the goal of Title IX hearings and the goal of the criminal justice system. Criminal justice system obviously is to punish when a crime has taken place. But the Title IX specifically is about access to education. And these hearings are about ensuring that students are not denied access to education. As you say, that's a federal issue, but I think our role can be finding out how Title IX is being enforced on our campuses, making sure that there are accommodations being made. Some of what we have heard or has been presented to us indicates that the process itself is not always supportive of the person who has been victimized, and that the investigations are not done in a timely fashion, and that the victim is oftentimes put in a position of having to be the one to change campuses, change schools, change whatever, because the alleged perpetrator, is still on the campus or still around that student. That is impacting that student's access to education, which is what Title IX is all about. So again, we don't have a role to play necessarily in Title IX itself, but we certainly, I think, have a role to play in looking at how it's being carried out, if it's being carried out in a way that's true to what Title IX is supposed to be about. And I think Chairman Zerwas maybe kind of alluded to this too, that part of what we also heard about yesterday had to do with these hearings and how we can ensure due process for both sides, make sure that not only are we being sensitive to the victims, but ensuring that there's a process in place for the alleged perpetrator to have due process in their hearing. But recognizing that there is a big difference in what happens in an administrative Title IX type hearing, what the ramifications of that are, which are life-altering if you're expelled. But as was pointed out, with the criminal situation, you're talking about potentially losing your freedom. Very different outcomes we're talking about here, and we need to recognize that it's not the same process, at the same time ensuring that there is fairness in the process. And I think that's something we also are going to need to be looking at.
You mentioned some legislation that came out of the last legislative session. This bill, I believe, required universities to include during their orientation some kind of education about the processes and services that are available, and also required that information be published prominently on their websites. have you found that those universities have lived up to those requirements?
It's kind of a setup question, right? Well, we have not done any review at this point, although I think we now know that we need to do one to make sure that we do. I looked at the website for the University of Texas at Austin, since it's here in my community, and was unable to find, without a long search, the information about what someone might need to have if they were going to report a sexual assault, if they were going to try to seek help. In fact, if you get to the student services, you get to student life, you get to health and safety, and you try to do a search on that website for rape, what it brought up for me was a faculty member or a staff member whose name was rape, rather than giving me the information I needed. When I looked at the health and safety page, there were quick links to a variety of things, including gun safety, or I'm not sure if it said gun, maybe this is my bias coming out when I say gun safety, but guns on campus. And so it seems like that would be a logical place to also have a link to where you could readily get to something about sexual assaults. There was nothing there, nothing on that page. So I think we do have some work to do to make sure that this is actually following what our intention was of that legislation.
And I'll chime in real quick on that, because, and I think sometimes it's an oversight on our part that we pass a bill and we think, okay, it's going to be put into place, and unless we sort of accidentally perhaps try to find out, oh, is it on there or not, we don't know. But take a look at what we did with guns on campus, and we said, okay, look, legislature's going to come back and look at this and see if, in fact, did you, in a responsible, diligent way, consider, where guns would and would not be allowed on the campus, and specifically identified that that's something that would happen. I'm going to tell you, this issue, in my mind, rises so far above that we perhaps that's something that we need to think about in the future, is to say it very clearly, we expect this to be done, and in fact, we're going to have a follow-up. It's going to be written into the bill, and we're going to ask that you demonstrate to us where is this information on your website. And I think that's a big part of, as we look at this in general, is keeping it front and center. There are a lot of other issues that can kind of cloud the picture out there, if you will. Guns on campus are one of them, and so, I think this one, though, rises to such a high level, and clearly it does, because the speaker included it in one of just a few, interim charges out there, that it really behooves us, as we consider some of these issues, to make sure that we're doing things to keep them front and center, and make sure that the universities own them. We call it accountability, but it should be ownership by them, so that we can, in fact, have some sense of confidence and certainty that these things are being accomplished.
Yeah, I also want to add on to what the chairman said about accountability and ownership, really. So under the VAWA, which is the Violence Against Women Act, there are amendments, one of them being something called Campus Save, where schools are required to give this information to students, and it be an ongoing process, not just at orientation. But it goes back to that enforcement piece again. And we know federally that enforcement is kind of slow, but we're seeing the same thing on the state level. So I would love to make sure that there is that accountability piece there, not just for a website, but for the stuff behind the website. And so I gave an example yesterday in the hearing where, there was a state, schools were required to have this information, and one school copied and pasted another school's policy. And so when the student went to seek those resources didn't even exist on their campus. And so the survivor in this case actually has this line, this is best practices are only best when they're practiced. So you could have a really nice website, a really nice policy, but if there's nothing on the back end of that when you go to access that service, and that person, is a Title IX coordinator, but the Title IX coordinator isn't trained or isn't trauma informed, then it doesn't go far enough. So we can have posters and we can have websites, but we also need to make sure not only are they there and present and students know they exist, but the resources to back them up are also there as well.
Well, along those same kind of lines, these universities are getting a lot of instructions right now from both the state and federal government, but what's happening to them if they don't follow through? Do you feel like the university, what should happen to a university if it's not living up to those expectations?
Okay, so what does happen and what should happen might be different questions. So currently under Title IX, which is enforced by the Office for Civil Rights, which is under the Department of Education, if a school is found in violation of a civil rights law, there's two options. One is very nuclear, they could lose all federal funding, and then the other is something like a plea bargain or a resolution agreement where the school promises to be better. And there are conversations, and a lot of them are in good faith and some of them are not. And so you see schools under investigation time and time again, and that nuclear option of revoking all federal funding has never been used. And so there is no intermediate sanctions for Title IX. There are for Clery. Clery does have the ability to fine monetarily. But unfortunately, what we're seeing is some of these cases are taking so long that students are dropping out or graduating or transferring. And then on what should happen / what is happening is schools are changing. But usually, as we see, in the Baylor case, for example, that was because of media. And so when you have, like you mentioned previously, the media microscope, focusing in on a campus, that's when things are changing. But unfortunately, that's on the backs of survivors, and it shouldn't be incumbent on 18 and 19-year-old students to hold their institutions accountable. They should be worrying about finals, not lawsuits against their school. And so I think I'd like to see more universities be proactive, not just when that media spotlight comes down or the Department of Education, has an investigation or something like that, but schools actually taking leadership and ownership of this, like we heard some yesterday, some schools were doing, saying, yes, we know it's a problem, it's not just us, but we recognize it happens on our campus and therefore we're going to do something about it. So I'd like to see more proactivity.
I can say from experience that universities do not love it getting out in the media that they're being investigated by the Department of Education or anything like that. But I can also say from experience that reporters have a certain amount of ADD, and they like to jump on a story, but then something else pops up and we run to something else, and then maybe there's not much follow-up about whether things have actually changed on campus. Representative Howard, do you think that scrutiny, that increased attention is enough? Should there be more kind of skin in the game for universities if they're not living up to their expectations?
I don't know if I have a good answer for that other than, of course, I think we need to be paying attention to it. One of the things that I think has come out because of your reporting and others who have been looking at this issue in our state, kind of to what Annie's been talking about here, is how some of the institutions pushed this under the rug, didn't stand up and say this is an issue, put the victims in this very unfortunate position of maybe not even be able to report, but certainly if they do report, then not getting the support they need from their institutions, and tied up in some of the things you're talking about here, because of the impacts on how the institution will be perceived in the community, because of how it might be perceived among its funders. The other thing that came up, of course, was tying into athletics, and that's been part of several of the issues in our state, and how it has appeared that institutions have protected athletes and the athletics program over students who have been criminally assaulted. That's clearly something we need to keep front and center, as Chairman Zerwas was just saying. This is a serious issue. We gave a lot of attention to guns, which are also a serious issue. But as we have seen with the statistics here, this is something that is going on right now on our campuses, affecting a huge number of students and their families. And we need to keep our eyes on this. I don't know what the exact answer is about what we need to do. I think that's part of why we're having this interim, to look at it and figure out what our next steps are going to be. But yes, we have to be paying attention.
And if you could present them with a list of bills to consider, or a list of laws or changes to make, what would be at the top of that list?
Yeah, let me get my notebook back here. Honestly, like one of the things we talked about yesterday is the prevention side. And I think that if we're starting to talk about this issue in college at orientation, it's way too late. So one of the things I would really like you all, both and the committee, to consider is something like a healthy relationship and safe relationship, dating violence prevention bill that would require high school students as part of their health curriculum, as they're learning, how to be safe adults, that this is something that they're presented with, because as we know, there are survivors that are already going to into college as survivors. And if we can tackle this issue earlier at age-appropriate levels, that was something I would love to see. And as I said yesterday, there was a bill that passed in Virginia 98-0 that did the same thing. And if they can do it in Virginia, I think they can do it in Texas. That would be one thing on the prevention side. And then on the survivor support side, a lot of institutions, and as somebody who used to work in higher ed, I know everything is very siloed, and sometimes it's hard to communicate across departments, and making sure that that survivor support is there. So even if a student does report, making sure that they have a holistic system where academic advisors know what their role is, what accommodations they can have under Title IX and under the Campus Sexual Assault Victims Bill of Rights, making sure that the counseling center knows where to send people, and having another best practice would be having one confidential advisor, which has been shown in police departments actually to increase reporting. So if you have one person who's confidential, who knows everything from the Black Student Union to the LGBT Center to counseling to academic advising, and it's all streamlined and coordinated, and you have that one person that people can go to, you will see reports increase, but also survivor support. And I would like to have better data. And so right now, like I mentioned in the first question about Clery, it's all geography based. And so to have numbers so we can make better policy, like I could say, yes, every school should have XYZ under federal law, but you can't cookie cutter all best practices. A&M's gonna look different than a smaller community college, and we need to address those nuances and differences. So I think having better data and having campus climate surveys at those schools so you can make better informed policy decisions is important. And so with Clery, it's not just how many people were assaulted on campus that then formally reported, but how many people reported, period, regardless of where they were, if they were across the street. Of those, how many chose to go to the police, chose to go through an adjudication procedure. Of those, what were the outcomes of those hearings and what were the sanctions, and having a more data, more scaffolding of these questions can give us better information to inform policymakers on how to make and how to write better policy.
Representative Howard, I believe I think you agree with that, right? Because that was something you were seeking in the last session.
Well, yes, as a matter of fact, my colleague here in Travis County, Representative Donna Dukes, this has been an issue that she's been paying attention to for a while, and she had a bill last session that didn't get a hearing, and I took a part of her bill as an amendment to the legislation that was going to require posting on the website to have a statewide task force that would bring together higher education institutions, law enforcement, and look at what our best practices are in the state, what's currently going on, getting some of the statistics that Annie's talking about so we know what we're working with here. But unfortunately, we had a legislative body last time that you heard the word study and it failed, part of the limited government movement. And so we weren't able to get that attached to it, and yet here we are today saying that's exactly what we need. And we could have been down the road further on that if we had added that amendment, and we were already working on it.
Well, some of these things that we've been discussed, whether it's increasing resources, counselor resources, things like that, obviously cost money. We're in a situation where it seems like tuition costs and funding for higher ed are going to be a popular subject in the upcoming session. We've heard some people from the Senate side already kind of make their positions clear on this. Are there going to be resources available, Chairman, to do some of these things that we've talked about on the stage?
Right. Well, I think again, Matt, it just comes down to what are the priorities of the state. I think it's very clear that the governor and leadership throughout the legislature has said, higher education is an incredibly important part of our future. Having a certain number of people with some type of certificate or post-high school education is critically important out there, and we need to be sure that we're providing adequate resources for the population to be able to tap into that. Otherwise, we're going to fall way behind in terms of workforce issues and so forth. So I think what it comes down to is yes, we need to be highly focused on making sure higher education is robust and is viable, and the state is making an adequate investment in it. Part of that is again, coming back to some of these more thorny issues, that needs to be an integral part of talking about higher education. It has to be part of the conversation. And if that requires us to put together a task force or a committee, a lot of times that's the way things do get started. I mean, I carried 2 bills, health-related bills last time that did exactly that. One on HPV, another one on palliative care. They were committees. They had a work defined for them to do, and they had a sunset on them. So they weren't going to be there forever, which I think is incredibly important.
This had a sunset too, but I happen to have a D after my name.
We can change that.
No, thank you.
I can help you with that. But no, I think that it's something that if through the interim here, and again, the speaker asked us to look at this. He obviously sees this as something important. And I think that it behooves us as the Higher Education Committee to respond to that interim charge and to bring forward something that can really be a high priority in the upcoming session so that we can address this issue along with all the other higher education issues. You mentioned the budget. I think, Representative Howard and I would agree it's going to be a leaner budget this coming time than what we've had in the past. And the key is for us is going to be to protect higher education because, both of us, Representative Howard is on the Appropriations Committee. I've been on it for 4 sessions prior to this one. That is prime pickings when you're looking at scaling something back because of what we've already seen. Let's go out and just raise the tuition for the kids that are coming in. That carries a whole different group of challenges for us and stuff in terms of meeting expectations in the future. So I think it's something that we're going to keep front and center. We're going to make sure that we promote some reasonable things and expectations of our universities. And as I mentioned with the guns on campus, we need to be sure we come back and look at that and say, hey, did you follow through on this? And at the end of the day, universities, higher education systems are businesses. And we probably need to think a little bit about that in terms of how we approach this from a business perspective and say the state does have an investment in you. Are you in fact meeting the expectations that the state has, and then what are the consequences of that?
Yeah, just to go off this to talk about economics a little bit. So sexual assault is also an economic issue. It's a public health issue. And when you think about survivors who over 30% of them develop some sort of psychiatric disability, whether that be PTSD like you mentioned, anxiety, depression, they're seeking resources at those schools. And if you could prevent that from happening, you're preventing an adjudication hearing, you're preventing the need for these resources in the first place. But also, a lot of survivors incur a lot of debt. So student debt is already a huge problem, but if you're dropping classes and don't know that you can have a medical leave under Title IX, or if you have incompletes, or if you take time off and then have to go back and pay a reapplication fee, like all of those things, therapy fees, the survivor pays a lot and the school's paying a lot, and that affects taxpayers and the economy as a whole. And so that's an economic argument for prevention, but on the other side, it's not necessarily the state giving additional money to the schools, it's an allocation of resources at the schools. And you think about how much money sports programs and boosters have and all that. You had Harvard, the students had a bake sale for sexual assault prevention resources. And you're saying Harvard with an endowment, I don't even know how much it is, billions probably, and your students are baking cookies. I mean, like thinking about the allocation of the resources at the schools, and that's something where you could look into that oversight.
You mentioned yesterday that at a very conservative estimate, there are hundreds of students who are victims of sexual assault on campus at a place like A&M or UT. And if that many students were having their laptops stolen or something like that, you'd see a much stronger response. I wanted to bring up one other thing before we get to some audience questions, which was that you guys had some universities that were testifying yesterday before you guys, talking about their situations. One I think that was that particularly stood out was Texas A&M, which is currently under investigation by the Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights for how they're handling accusations of sexual assault on campus. An interesting kind of situation there is that they're being investigated based on a complaint not by a rape survivor, but by a student who is suspended from campus after a disciplinary hearing. His argument was that his rights were ignored in this case, and that basically they were taking a survivor's word over his. A&M has expressed frustration in the hearing. They've expressed strong frustration to me about this. They talk about how they have, held more than 1,000, training sessions or awareness sessions on campus. They've tried very hard to follow the rules here, and now they're facing scrutiny about possibly going too far. Chairman, I mean, what does that say about, this not necessarily being an easy solution for anyone, and how universities should be approaching this?
Right. Well, I think that's exactly as you said. It reflects the complexity of the issue and perhaps some of the fluidity of the issue, if you will. I mean, campuses are very unique environments, and one campus isn't the same as another. University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill is not the University of Texas, and certainly not Texas A&M. And I think you have to just consider in balance, because you aren't in a court of law and you don't have perhaps some of the same rigor, if you will, that comes in a court of law, but in these administrative hearings, you're leaving it to people to try to do the best job that they know how to do with the information that is brought to them and their sense of what is their duty to both parties that are involved. A very, very difficult issue to get in the middle of in terms of, saying, did one go too far or not go too far? But I do think that we do have to be sensitive to, the individual who is accused because of the nature of these circumstances. It's often one voice against another voice. And, how comfortable are people in terms of saying the evidence weighs this way or that way? I think the main thing is that, we need to be sure that the universities get caught looking at this real hard and trying to come up with solutions, knowing that they may not get it on balance right every time, or at least to some of us as outsiders looking into it, but know that the amount of effort, the amount of resources that they're dedicating to this are in fact genuine, and they have the interest of the students in mind, their lives in mind, and doing everything they can to make sure that that they have done things in a just way, but also have done things in a way that helps promote these people who are very young in their life, that they can get some direction in their life that is a consequence of their higher education. And so a very complicated issue in a nutshell is what it is, and that's just one sort of vignette that reflects that.
Could I real quickly add, I know that Annie had indicated that FBI statistics and maybe others as well have shown over a period of time that false accusations occur as infrequently as 2% of the time, up to about 8% of the time, and that tracks with other types of crimes that are committed where there are false accusations. And we know that people are falsely accused of other crimes. We hear stories about that, but I think there's a unique set of eyes on this particular crime where we tend to have, for whatever reason, I think that's part of what we need to be looking at here. What are the reasons? Why is it that we are more concerned, it appears, in this particular criminal act about false accusation than we are perhaps in some other crimes that are committed? And that may be anecdotal, but I think that that's something that we see over and over again. And I think that's something we need to pay attention to while we're also ensuring due process and making sure that there's a fair system that does ensure that the person who has been accused has due process.
Definitely, and I echo that. But also something to know just about the way the Department of Education works. There are a lot of schools that have multiple complaints against them and there are multiple ongoing investigations. And I'm not speaking specifically about A&M here, but just because there is one case that's public that you hear about, that might not be the only complaint. And a lot of them are anonymous and not in the press. So that's something to think about too. But also to better training on these hearing panels benefits everyone. It evens the scales. And right now, I think at a lot of schools, they're tilted one way or the other. And so better training helps everyone.
Okay. Very good. Well, we have about 9 minutes left, and I wanted to open it up to you guys if you had any questions from the audience. There's a microphone that is being moved around so we can get this on tape. But it looks like we have a question right here. Okay, so go ahead.
So it's no surprise that fraternities are generous donors to the universities. Is there research in the correlation of the conflict of interest? Because it seems like when you disturb the frat life and try to crack down on them, it kind of disturbs the whole institution of the university. So who's looking out for the accountability to go to those frats and start holding them accountable?
Well, I'll start, but I'm going to pivot over here to Annie in just a second because I know she knows more about this. But I think when we were talking about the Clery Act and the geographical nature of that, and the fact that though campuses are fraternities are closely aligned with the campus, they're not a part of campus housing, and
some of them. It depends on the campus.
Okay,
yeah.
so some of them. This is why I need to refer to her. But the fact is, I think to your point, that certainly we need to look at, and this is on a national level, what kind of reporting is important to have if the fraternities are connected with the campus, regardless of whether they're part of campus housing or not, and events and instances occur there, they should be a part of the reporting so that we have a more accurate reflection of what's really going on. But
yeah, I mean, absolutely. It's a hard issue, and I don't want to just focus on Greek life because it's a much broader issue, and I don't want to pick on one community, but it is a really big problem there. And as we saw at the national level, our organization has spoken both to fraternities and sororities, and there was actually something I don't remember when they first introduced it, but it sort of died down, with the misnomer, I would say, the Safe Campus Act. And it was introduced by a lot of the fraternities to members of Congress who also are fraternity brothers, saying that you, as a survivor, they wouldn't hear the case at a university unless that person first reported to the police, among other things. And so there's a really antagonistic relationship with some fraternities, and then there's some great ones who are doing, amazing work, and it's chapter by chapter and school by school. But I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done there. And also recognizing the fact that a male is more likely to be sexually assaulted than be falsely accused. And there are a lot of survivors in fraternities, whether that be from childhood or hazing or from some other instance. And so I think, there's a really strong possibility and partnership there that needs to be stronger of prevention of men, talking to other guys, about the issue, not just as bystanders or supporting, their sorority sisters or other women, but also men. And I would love to see more become engaged in that conversation. And I think we need to do a better job of not scaring them away and seeing them as, you're not the perpetrator, you're an ally, and reaching out with that mentality, I think, is absolutely crucial because we need men involved.
And I would just, tag on to this as we have mentioned about, what is kind of the social and cultural fabric of universities. Well, Greek life, let's face it, is a big part of the social and cultural fabric of universities out there. And, my sense is that, as I think as Annie said, they don't want to be characterized this way. This is not how they want to be known as. It's no badge of honor or anything. In fact, it's just the opposite. And for those people that have a strong attachment to Greek life and even into the alumni phase, they could do a great benefit to this particular issue by owning it and trying to bring some reform, if you will, to some of the aspects of Greek life, because there are numerous benefits to Greek life out there, I think, in terms of what it can bring to the campus life and so forth. This, unfortunately, is an incredibly black mark, on some of that, not all of it, but some of it.
And I think you bring a good point with donors and alumni too, and I think everyone has a role to play in that. If you give to your institution, checking in and saying, do you have all of these things in place? How are you handling sexual assault? And until you do, these best practices, I'm going to withhold my donation. I'm not putting it somewhere else, but I'm not going to donate to this fraternity, to this organization, to this university until you fix something or till you show some sort of tangible effort to combating the problem. So I think, as folks here, some of us might have children in universities, might be working at a university, alums. You can do something too, even if you're not on campus right now.
All right.
Hello, thank you for the panel. Annie, it's good to meet you. I'm Fran Sterling. I help write the parent guide for the hunting ground. So we exchanged emails with the hunting ground a bit ago. So it's good to meet you. And I'm here really as a parent and as an educator, and I'm very much of an advocate of proactive rather than reactive work. And I'd like to have folks on the panel comment on the role of parent education, on the role of parents with their students, with their young people before they get to college. What can Texas, given its large influence in the role of education in this country, what can the role of Texas play in secondary education, in helping teachers prepare their students around issues of healthy relationships and consent? What kinds of recommendations have you seen or actions have you seen across the country, or a school district that we could spotlight that's doing really positive things that we could all mimic and use as both parents and educators, and keep it so that we're not at the place of reacting on college campuses and trying to fix a broken system, but also making the system much more accountable before they even get to university.
I'll start. Nice to I can't see very well because of the lights, but I will come say hi after. Yeah, I think parents absolutely have a crucial role. Like I was talking a little bit before about alumni, when you are looking for a college for your child, asking those hard questions at your schools, when you do tours and looking online to see what sort of information they have. But before that, I think there's a really important preventative role that shouldn't just fall on teachers. I think the school district should definitely have something in their curriculum earlier, but making sure parents know that this is happening. And we know the average age that young boys, look at porn for the first time is, middle school age. And the fact that these conversations aren't necessarily happening in their communities or in their churches or at home, that's where they're getting their information. And so I really think whatever community-based groups, this has to be part of the social dialogue and curriculum there. And I would love to talk to you more about action items that we could do here in Texas.
Well, I will just say too about public education and kind of the challenges we've had in Texas with the different ideologies surrounding what should or should not be included in our health education curriculum. And, I would hope that we could get some common ground and joining together of all different factions looking at evidence-based programs that promote healthy relationships, because we're talking about all kinds of benefits to our young people and society as a whole if we are helping create the tools that they need to have those healthy relationships, to keep themselves safe, to be safe with other people. It's not just about sexual assault, that's about all kinds of things. So I know that Annie mentioned that she has helped with some legislation in other states looking at how to incorporate this into the required curriculum. And I think that's something that we can look at here is what are best practices, what really works, what gives us the outcomes we want, And let's get some good bipartisan support behind that and get that passed through our legislature.
Okay, well, that was perfect timing because I think we are at the end of our panel. So thank you very much for all of you. A lot of great insight.